The sun had already been up for 3 hours when David Reyes stepped out of the land cruiser and felt the heat press against him like a hand on his chest. He was 41 years old, a wildlife researcher who had spent the better part of 2 decades in sub-Saharan Africa, and he had learned long ago that the Savanna never warns you before it changes everything. He had worked alongside lions, slept within earshot of hyenas, and once spent a terrifying night pressed against a termite mound, while a herd of buffalo circled a waterhole not 20 meters from where he crouched. But nothing, not a single moment, in all those years, had prepared him for what was about to happen on a dry morning in the Laikipia Plateau of Kenya. If you have ever had something chase you, really chase you, not a dog that ran a few steps and gave up, but a large, powerful animal that committed to the pursuit with every muscle in its body, then you already know the particular quality of fear that rewires something fundamental in the human brain. It does not feel like ordinary fear. It feels like a door opening in your mind that you did not know was there, and behind that door is something ancient, something that has nothing to do with thought or reason, something that simply says, go. If you have not yet subscribed, do it now. Because what happened to David Reyes, across half a mile of open African savanna, is one of the most extraordinary wildlife encounters we have ever documented. And we are just getting started. The baboon troop David had been observing for 3 months numbered 67 individuals. He knew them the way a person knows a neighborhood. He knew their rhythms, their personalities, their hierarchies. He had given many of them informal names, not out of sentimentality, but because in field research, naming helps with rapid identification when you are scribbling notes in a moving vehicle or squinting through a lens. The dominant male, the alpha, was an olive baboon of exceptional size. David estimated his weight at somewhere between 45 and 50 kilograms, which placed him at the very upper end of the scale for his species. His canines, when he yawned in the morning, as baboons often do, both as a display of aggression and as a genuine stretch of the jaw muscles, were each roughly 5 centimeters long, sharp, curved, built not for eating fruit, though he ate plenty of it, but for fighting other males, and, when necessary, for killing. David called him Goliath. The name had seemed appropriate on the first morning he observed the troop, when Goliath had squared off against a younger challenger near a cluster of fever trees and ended the dispute so quickly and with such casual, overwhelming dominance that the challenger had retreated screaming before a single bite was delivered. Goliath had simply risen to his full height, fixed the younger male with a stare that seemed to compress the air between them, and walked forward. That was all. The younger baboon had understood immediately. There was something in the way Goliath moved that communicated absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that does not need to be loud because it has never had reason to doubt itself. For 3 months, David had maintained what he considered a respectful and professional distance. He followed the troop on foot and in the vehicle, always keeping at least 50 meters of open ground between himself and the nearest baboon. He had been advised by the Kenyan Wildlife Authority contact, who had briefed him before the study began, that olive baboon troops habituate to human observers over time, that they would come to regard him as a neutral and non-threatening presence, a sort of large, slow, harmless mammal that followed them around and did nothing interesting. This was broadly true. The younger animals had become almost completely indifferent to him. Some of the females and juveniles had begun to feed within 30 meters of where he sat. Even a few of the subordinate males had learned to walk past him without breaking stride. Goliath had never fully habituated. He tolerated David, which is different from accepting him. Every morning, when the troop moved off from its sleeping trees, Goliath would pause and look back at the following researcher with an expression that David described later as deeply unimpressed. Not threatening, exactly. More like a border guard, examining documents he has already decided are insufficient. David kept his distance. He avoided direct eye contact, which in baboon society is a challenge. He moved slowly. He crouched when he took notes, making himself smaller. He did everything right. He had done everything right for 3 months. The morning of the incident began like every other. David had positioned himself downwind of the troop's sleeping trees, a stand of acacias on a low rocky outcrop before dawn. He watched through binoculars as the troop woke, groomed, fed on shoots and early insects, and began its daily movement south and east across a broad plain of mixed grassland and scattered bush. The long rains had been good that year, and the grass stood at roughly knee-height across most of the open ground, dense enough to make walking uncomfortable, but not dense enough to offer any real concealment. The sky was clear and enormous, and the sort of blue that seems to have weight to it, pressing down on the landscape from above. He was perhaps 40 meters behind the rear of the troop and moving parallel to their direction of travel when he made his error. It was not a dramatic error. It was the kind of small, accumulated misjudgment that field researchers make dozens of times without consequence, until the one time when all the variables align against them. He had stopped to write a note about a female he had been tracking, a higher-ranking female who had been displaying signs of cycling and whose interactions with Goliath had been a specific focus of his observation. He stopped walking, crouched, and began to write. The troop continued moving. He did not immediately register how much ground they were covering because he was focused on his notebook. When he looked up, the rear of the troop was perhaps 80 meters ahead. He stood and began to walk faster to close the gap. This was not unusual. Troops move quickly. Researchers have to adjust their pace constantly. He was not running. He was walking briskly, the way you walk when you are slightly behind schedule, and the ground between him and the troop was open grass with no obstacles of significance, and he was not paying particular attention to the tree line to his left. Goliath had separated from the main group. This happens with alpha males. They range further, check the perimeter, investigate potential threats and resources. They operate on a larger map than the rest of the troop. David had noted Goliath ranging independently dozens of times. What he had not noted, because he had not been watching the tree line, was that Goliath had positioned himself at the edge of a small stand of bush, approximately 30 meters to David's left, and that David, in his brisk walk to close the gap with the troop, was now moving directly toward that position rather than parallel to it, because the troop had angled slightly and David had corrected his course to match, without realizing that this correction was bringing him closer to the tree line. He heard the alarm calls from the troop first, that sharp, percussive bark that baboons use when they see a predator. Several animals at once, a wall of sound that goes through you like electricity. David stopped. He looked toward the troop. He saw baboons running, not in the scattered panic that follows a lion, but in the organized retreat of animals responding to a specific threat. He registered several things simultaneously. The alarm calls had not started when he stopped. They had started roughly 2 seconds before, when Goliath emerged from the tree line. He did not see Goliath at first, because he was looking at the wrong place. He heard him. There is a sound that a large male baboon makes when he is not bluffing, not displaying, not warning. It is different from the alarm bark and different from the territorial scream. It is a lower, more continuous sound, a kind of grunt roar that seems to come from deep in the chest, and it carries a quality that the human nervous system recognizes before the conscious mind has processed any information at all. David heard that sound and turned, and Goliath was 20 meters away and already accelerating. What happened in the next several seconds is difficult to reconstruct in sequence because, as David explained later, his memory of it has the quality of a dream, not fuzzy or unclear, but too vivid, too saturated, each element standing out from every other element with impossible sharpness. He remembered the sound of the grass against his legs as he ran. He remembered the quality of the light on Goliath's gray-brown coat. He remembered his own voice, which surprised him because he had no awareness of deciding to make a sound, producing a kind of wordless exclamation that was not quite a shout and not quite a scream. He remembered the ground, the way it looked immediately in front of his feet, the particular shape of a small bare patch of earth he stepped on, a detail his brain had decided was critical information. He ran. Goliath ran. The distance between them was roughly 15 meters when David broke into a full sprint. He was not a small man. He was fit, lean from months of fieldwork, accustomed to covering long distances on foot in difficult terrain. Under normal circumstances, he could sustain a reasonable pace for considerable distances. Under these circumstances, he ran faster than he had run since he was a teenager, and he knew immediately that it was not going to be enough. Baboons are extraordinarily fast. A large male can cover ground at speeds that approach 30 kilometers per hour, and they do it with the low driving efficiency of an animal built to move across terrain that would slow a human considerably. The grass slowed David. It did not slow Goliath. He could hear him. That was what occupied the center of his consciousness during those first seconds. The sound of Goliath behind him, close enough that he could hear the impact of each stride, the particular rhythm of a quadruped at full speed, a sound nothing like the sound of a running human, lower and faster and more regular, a sound that seemed to be getting louder. David made a decision that he later described as the only coherent thought he produced during the entire pursuit. He did not run toward the vehicle, which was behind him and to his right, because running toward the vehicle would have required him to turn, and turning would have cost him time he did not have. He did not run toward the troop, because the troop was moving away from the commotion, and running toward them would have taken him toward Goliath's assumed direction of movement. He ran straight ahead, away from the tree line, out into the open grass, because open ground favors running, and Goliath, whatever his motivation, was a troop animal, and troop animals have limits to how far they will pursue a perceived threat away from their group. This was the correct analysis. It was also an analysis he had absolutely no time to verify, because he could not look back. Looking back means turning your head, and turning your head when a large primate is behind you risks losing your footing, and losing your footing on grass over uneven ground while moving at maximum speed is a serious problem. He ran. He kept his eyes forward. He listened. The sound behind him continued. He estimated, from the quality of the sound and the rate at which it seemed to change, that Goliath was maintaining a roughly constant distance, not gaining dramatically, but not losing ground either. He could feel his lungs beginning to limit him, the particular sensation of the body reaching the edge of what sprint effort can sustain. His legs were fine. His lungs were the problem, the burning, narrowing sensation that tells you the pace cannot be maintained much longer. He ran for what he later estimated was close to 40 seconds before the sound behind him changed. The footfall rhythm altered, slowed. There was a sharp vocalization, not the grunt roar of the pursuit, but something higher, more declarative. And then the sound of pursuit stopped. David ran for another 10 seconds before he let himself slow, and he slowed gradually because his body was not prepared to simply stop, and he moved through a series of stages from sprint to fast run to jog to staggering walk, and then he turned around. Goliath was standing approximately 60 meters behind him. He was not moving. He was looking at David with the direct, flat gaze that David had seen every morning for 3 months. The border guard with the insufficient documents. Except now, there was something additional in that gaze, something that David found almost impossible to describe to other people afterward, because it was not anger, exactly, and it was not satisfaction, and it was not simple threat. It was more like certainty. Goliath had stopped, not because he had given up, and not because he was incapable of continuing. He had stopped because he had decided that this was the appropriate point to stop, that whatever communication he had intended to deliver had been received, and that further pursuit was unnecessary. They looked at each other across 60 meters of open grassland for what David estimated was approximately 30 seconds. Then Goliath turned and walked back toward the tree line, unhurried, with the same heavy, deliberate movement that characterized everything he did, and disappeared into the bush. David stood in the grass for a long time after that. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he found unusual. He was aware of the silence, which was not actually silence because the Savanna is never silent, but which felt like silence after the intensity of the last several minutes. The troop alarm calls had stopped. He could hear hornbills somewhere to the north. He could hear the wind moving through the grass. He looked down at his hands and noticed they were shaking slightly, not dramatically, just a fine, high-frequency tremor that had nothing to do with his muscles being tired. He walked back to the vehicle. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. He drank from a water bottle. He wrote in his notebook. The entry, which he later shared, and which became a central piece of documentation for everything that followed, was notable for how clinical it was, how precisely he described the sequence of events, the timing, the distances, the behavioral signals. Years of field training expressing themselves even in the immediate aftermath of genuine terror. Only at the end of the entry did he write anything that stepped outside the framework of observation. He wrote, "I have never been more certain that I was going to be seriously hurt." And then he started the engine and drove back toward camp. The question that occupied him for weeks afterward was not why it had happened. The immediate why was clear enough. He had moved too close to a dominant male whose troop was nearby and who had been in a state of heightened territorial alertness, probably because of something David had not observed, possibly a territorial dispute with another troop that morning, possibly the presence of a predator that David had not detected, possibly simply the accumulated low-level irritation of 3 months of being followed by a large, strange, slow-moving creature who kept getting closer than the terms of their informal agreement stipulated. The immediate cause was something like that. What occupied him was a deeper question. At what point had Goliath made the decision? Not the decision to chase, but the decision to stop. Because Goliath had stopped precisely at the point where pursuit had delivered its message, where the communication was complete. This was not a mechanical failure of motivation. It was a decision, made by an animal, with full awareness of its own physical capacity and the capacity of the animal it was pursuing, to terminate a pursuit that had achieved its purpose. Goliath had never intended to catch David. He had intended to move David, and he had moved him across 40 meters of open grassland at the absolute limit of the researcher's physical capability, and then he had stopped because David was moved. This interpretation was not universally accepted when David discussed it with colleagues. Some suggested that Goliath had simply hit the limit of his willingness to move away from the troop, that the distance, not the communication, had been the determining factor. This is a reasonable position, and David did not argue against it strenuously, but he noted that Goliath had not decelerated gradually, the way an animal running out of motivation does. He had stopped abruptly, at a clear decision point, facing David, making direct eye contact, maintaining that contact for an extended period before turning. These are not the behaviors of an animal that has simply reached the edge of its territory's pull. These are the behaviors of an animal that is making a point. The baboon troop on the Laikipia Plateau has been the subject of continuous research for many years, part of a broader effort to understand the social dynamics of olive baboon societies in one of the last great savanna ecosystems in East Africa. The plateau itself is a remarkable landscape, sitting at an elevation of roughly 2,000 meters above sea level, cooler and more lush than the lowland savannas to the south and east, dominated by the kind of mixed grassland and acacia woodland that supports extraordinary concentrations of wildlife. Elephant move through the plateau in large herds. Buffalo congregate in the thousands in the wet season. Lion are present, and leopard and cheetah on the more open sections, and wild dog, increasingly rare across the continent, but holding on in pockets of wild land where the habitat and the tolerance of local communities allows it. In this landscape, the baboon troop occupies a particular ecological position. They are omnivores in the true sense, eating grass, seeds, roots, fruits, insects, eggs, and on occasion small mammals, including young gazelle and vervet monkeys, which they will hunt cooperatively when the opportunity presents. They are prey animals, in the sense that lion and leopard and cheetah and hyena will all take baboons when they can, and baboon troops spend a significant portion of their collective cognitive energy monitoring for predators and communicating about them. They are also, simultaneously, formidable opponents. A large male baboon is not an easy animal to kill. The canine teeth of a large male can inflict serious wounds on a lion, and there are documented cases of baboon troops mobbing and driving off predators, including leopards, that have attempted to take troop members. This dual nature, simultaneously prey and formidable, shapes everything about baboon society. The hierarchy within a troop is rigid and constantly negotiated, because in a world of real predators and real competitors, social order is a survival mechanism. The alpha male's position at the top of that hierarchy is maintained not just by his physical capacity, which is real, but by his willingness to demonstrate that capacity at critical moments. The display serves the troop as much as it serves the individual. When Goliath ran at David, He was doing something that every baboon in that troop was watching and registering. Something that said, "The boundary of this group is real, and I will enforce it," which is information that is useful to every troop member and potentially useful information to predators that might be observing from the tree line. In the weeks following the incident, David adjusted his protocols. He increased his minimum distance from 20 meters, which had been his informal standard, to 50 meters. He became more attentive to Goliath's ranging behavior, using the vehicle's elevated seating position to track the alpha male's position relative to his own before deciding to approach on foot. He was careful, always, about the angle of approach, making sure he was never moving in a line that would intercept rather than parallel Goliath's movements. And he began to pay closer attention to the state of the troop as a whole each morning, looking for the behavioral indicators of tension that suggested a heightened level of alertness. None of this prevented a second incident, which occurred approximately 6 weeks after the first, though this one had a different character entirely. David was on foot, 50 meters back, watching a subgroup of females feed on a termite mound when Goliath appeared from behind a shrub to his right, not charging, not vocalizing, simply present, having apparently walked a wide circle around the researcher's position to approach from an unexpected angle. He was perhaps 15 meters away when David noticed him, sitting, watching. David immediately dropped into a crouch, avoided eye contact, and waited. Goliath sat for approximately 3 minutes, then he walked away. David interpreted this as a different kind of communication, not the aggressive messaging of the first incident, but something more like an inspection, a check, as though Goliath were periodically confirming that the strange, slow mammal who followed the troop was still behaving acceptably. The crouching and eye avoidance, the submission signals, seemed to satisfy whatever assessment was being made. He sat, and then he left. This second interaction became as interesting to David as the chase, because it suggested something about the ongoing nature of the relationship between the researcher and the alpha male. Habituation, in wildlife research, is typically described as a one-directional process. The animal becomes accustomed to the human presence. But what David was observing seemed to have elements of bidirectionality. Goliath was also learning David, adjusting to him, developing a set of expectations and a set of responses to deviations from those expectations. The chase had established a boundary. The subsequent inspection had confirmed that the boundary was understood. The research continued because the relationship, strange and asymmetrical as it was in some fundamental sense functional. The Laikipia Plateau, in northern Kenya, sits in one of the most biologically rich regions of the African continent. Baboon troops here move through territories that overlap with dozens of other species, sharing resources and space in a web of relationships so complex that researchers working in the area sometimes describe it as less like an ecosystem and more like a city, a place of constant, overlapping, competing interests managed through a combination of overt conflict, tacit negotiation, and habit. The buffalo herds attract lion, which affects the movement patterns of the smaller antelopes, which affects the availability of certain grass species, which affects the feeding patterns of the baboons. Pull any thread, and the whole thing moves. Within this web, the baboon troop is simultaneously a significant ecological force and a highly vulnerable social unit. The 67 individuals who made up Goliath's troop consumed enormous quantities of plant material, insects, and occasional vertebrate prey, and their foraging behavior had measurable effects on the ground cover and invertebrate populations across their range. They also produced significant quantities of seed-laden droppings, contributing to the dispersal of dozens of plant species. Their presence in an area signaled to other species a certain level of safety, because baboon sentinels, posted in the trees and on elevated rocks, surveyed enormous areas for predators and communicated what they found with a sophistication that other species learned to read. Impala and zebra, in the vicinity of a baboon troop, benefit from the troop's alarm calls. The calls are not directed at these other species, but they are legible to them, and the troop is itself a target. In the year of David's study, the troop lost 3 members to predators, 2 juveniles, taken in circumstances that the researchers could not fully document, and an adult female, who was pulled from a sleeping tree during the night by a leopard in an attack that was audible to David in his camp, and that he listened to with the complicated feelings of a person who cares about what he studies and also knows that the leopard is hungry. In the morning, there were feathers of guinea fowl on the grass near the acacia, which suggested the leopard had also fed more widely during the night. But the female baboon was gone, and her infant, who had been taken from her and was found alive and uninjured but alone and silent on a low branch, was subsequently adopted by an older female who had lost her own infant several months before. These are the textures of a landscape that has been managing itself for millions of years. The olive baboon, Papio anubis, named for the jackal-headed Egyptian god, has been a feature of this landscape for perhaps 2 million years, evolving alongside the big cats and the ungulates and the other primates in a co-evolutionary dance of predation and counter-adaptation and ecological niche-finding that has produced an animal of extraordinary behavioral flexibility and social sophistication. They thrive where many other primates would not, because they can eat almost anything and live almost anywhere that has trees for sleeping and enough open ground for foraging. They are found across a vast arc of sub-Saharan Africa, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Horn of Africa in the east, across savannas and forest margins and even semi-arid scrubland. Within this range, baboon troops are shaped by their local environment. Troops in areas with high predator density behave differently from troops in areas where predators are rare. Troops that are frequently exposed to human activity develop different patterns of interaction with people than troops in more remote areas. Goliath's troop had a history of relatively limited human contact before David's research began, which made the habituation process slower and, as the chase demonstrated, more potentially dangerous. Animals that are genuinely unaccustomed to humans do not have the frameworks for neutral interaction that habituated animals develop. They respond to unfamiliar human behavior through the only frameworks available to them, which are the frameworks for dealing with predators and competitors, and researchers who forget this put themselves at risk. David had not forgotten it, exactly. He had simply accumulated a few weeks of relatively smooth interaction and allowed that accumulation to erode a little of the precision of his protocols. This is common. It is, in fact, probably inevitable for anyone doing extended close observation wildlife research. The consistency of daily experience creates expectations, and expectations create vulnerability. Goliath had been there, on the edge of David's awareness, every morning for 3 months, yawning and looking unimpressed, and the morning it mattered, David had been looking at his notebook. There is a lesson here that goes beyond wildlife research. The places where we think we understand something are often the places where we are most vulnerable to surprise, because understanding, or the feeling of it, makes us reduce our attention. The savanna does not offer the same reduction. It maintains its attention always, in all directions, because it cannot afford not to. The research tells us that large-brained social mammals, including baboons and including humans, are capable of a remarkable range of social behaviors, but that beneath that range, in every one of us, there is something older, something that was there before the social behaviors, before language and hierarchy and the long practice of living together. It is the thing that made David run. It is the thing that made Goliath stop. The morning after the chase, David was back in the field before dawn. He had not considered not going. The research was not finished, and more than that, the encounter had produced data that he was genuinely excited to analyze. Observations about Goliath's behavior before, during, and after the pursuit that were, as far as he could determine from the available literature, not particularly well documented. He set up his position downwind of the sleeping trees, and he watched the troop wake up, and he kept his distance, and Goliath did his morning yawn in the first light, and looked back toward David, with the border guard expression, "The documents are insufficient." David did not move closer. He wrote in his notebook. He stayed where he was. Goliath turned away. The troop moved south, and David followed at 50 meters, careful of his angle, careful of the tree line to his left. The grassland is an enormous and indifferent place, full of things that are better at being in it than we are, and the best researchers who work there are the ones who never entirely forget that they are visitors, allowed in on terms that are not their own to set. The baboon has been navigating this landscape for 2 million years. The researcher has been there for 3 months. The appropriate response to that disparity is not fear, exactly, and it is not paralysis. It is the particular quality of attention that the savanna itself models, steady, wide, and never entirely sure that the next moment will resemble the one that just passed. The grasslands of the Laikipia Plateau stretch for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, from where David stood that second morning, and they were full, as they always are, of things happening that no researcher was watching. A leopard in a fig tree to the north, sleeping with a gazelle across its branch, its tail hanging. A herd of plains zebra, 2 kilometers to the east, moving in a loose column through long grass, manes shifting in the morning wind. A martial eagle circling at altitude, so high it was visible only as a dark comma against the deep blue, watching with the flat, comprehensive attention of a predator whose eyes can resolve detail at distances that require telescopes to match. And in the middle of all this, a male baboon of exceptional size, moving south through mixed grass and scattered bush, leading 66 other individuals through a territory that his body understood the way a human understands a childhood neighborhood. Every landmark, every water source, every good feeding tree, every potential danger, held in a cognitive map that had been built over years of daily traversal. Not thinking about David, not thinking about the chase. Moving, foraging, monitoring, leading, doing what he did every day in a landscape that had shaped him over 2 million years into exactly what he was. And 50 meters behind him, David, writing in his notebook, keeping his distance, learning. The encounter between a human researcher and a dominant male baboon on an open African savanna seems, on first consideration, like a story about danger, about the physical reality of working close to wild animals that are capable of seriously hurting a person. And it is that. The risk was real. The canines were real. The speed of the pursuit was real. And the narrowness of the margin between David and those canines during the first 15 meters of the chase was something that he thought about more than once in the months that followed. But on second consideration, the encounter is a story about communication, about 2 social mammals with long evolutionary histories and real cognitive complexity negotiating a boundary in a landscape they were both trying to use. Goliath communicated a boundary. David received the communication and adjusted his behavior. The negotiation was not gentle, and it was not comfortable, and it involved a significant physical component that David found deeply unpleasant. But it was, in some important sense, a negotiation. It was not simply violence for its own sake. The stopping point, that moment 60 meters out, when Goliath planted himself in the grass and looked, suggests a level of intentionality in the communication that is difficult to explain as pure mechanical behavior. This is what makes baboons so compelling and so unsettling to work with. They are not so different from us that we cannot recognize what they are doing, but they are not so similar that we can predict it reliably. Goliath existed in a social world of real complexity, with alliances and rivalries, and long memories and strong preferences, and the capacity to respond to novelty in multiple ways, some of which were comfortable and some of which were not. He had decided, over 3 months, on a particular relationship with the researcher who followed his troop. When that relationship was, in his assessment, violated, he corrected it, decisively, unmistakably, and precisely to the degree that correction required. In the language of behavioral ecology, this is called a clear signal. In the language of a person who has just run half a mile across an open savanna faster than he has run since adolescence, it is called something else. David, when he wrote about it later for colleagues and for broader audiences, called it the moment the field became real. Every researcher who works close to wild animals has a version of this moment. The moment when the professional distance collapses and the animal in front of you is not a subject of study, but a fact of the physical world that is interacting with your body in real time. It clarifies things, he wrote. It makes you understand what you are actually doing, which is not observing from outside a system, but inhabiting a system from the inside, which means accepting that the system can act on you as easily as you can act on it. The Laikipia Plateau continues to be one of the most important research sites for baboon behavioral ecology in East Africa. The troop David worked with has been monitored continuously, and the data collected over years of observation have contributed to a growing understanding of how baboon social structures respond to environmental change, predator pressure, and human disturbance. Goliath remained the troop's dominant male for an additional 2.5 years after David's study, a tenure of considerable length that spoke to the exceptional physical and social capacity that David had observed firsthand. His eventual replacement by a younger male was, by all reports, swift and complete, following the pattern of most alpha transitions in olive baboon societies, a moment of challenge that became a moment of defeat that became a new hierarchy, the old order stepping back, without visible grief, into a subordinate position. David returned to the plateau twice more in the years following his initial study. On the second visit, he attempted to relocate and identify Goliath, which is possible if you know what to look for. He found him on the third morning, recognizable by size and by the pattern of a long scar on his right flank, a wound from some encounter that had happened before David's study or during the months David was not present. He was still with the troop, still subordinate to the new alpha, which is not automatic. Subordinate males sometimes leave their natal troop, but Goliath had stayed, and his age and experience and established relationships within the troop gave him a position that, while not the top, was not the bottom either. He ate well, he moved confidently, he was still, unmistakably, one of the largest and most physically imposing animals in the troop. He did not appear to recognize David, or if he did, the recognition did not express itself in any visible behavior. He moved through the grass with the same heavy, deliberate authority he had always had, eating and grooming, and watching the surrounding landscape with those pale, amber eyes that seemed to miss very little. On the second morning of that visit, David was sitting at his standard 50-meter distance